Hello and welcome to Access. My name is Shauna Montgomery and I'm an educational consultant with the CAIU in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My colleague Jerry Schaefer and I have developed the following module as part of the Tier 2 Assistive Technology Process. This process was designed to build capacity in AT within local school districts and cooperating agencies. Each module is designed to provide information about best practice in AT. Throughout this module, you will be asked to stop and complete reflection activities located on the Google form you received with the training video. These activities are required for members of our AT teams in order to receive credit for completing each step of the tiered training. When you see this slide, you will be prompted to pause your video and complete the reflection activity. Let's get started. In this module, we are going to look at the concepts of accessibility and usability. These two ideas are closely related to universal design, but since that was the focus of a module in Tier 1, we are not going to spend much time discussing that in this module. For our purposes, we're going to define accessibility as characteristics of products, services, and facilities, specifically to allow independent use by people with a variety of disabilities. Usability, on the other hand, is the user's ability to interact with and learn to use a product to complete a task with specific focus on effectiveness, efficiency, and ease of use. I want to look at these two definitions and talk a bit about the key differences. Accessibility is more about the features of the device or facility, and usability is more about the skills of the user. The focus of accessibility is more centered around the tool or location itself and is primarily achieved by adding on supports, often after the initial design of the product, service, or facility. This is the key difference between accessibility and universal design. Accessibility happens more on the back end by providing supports after the product or facility has already been in use and barriers have been identified based on users' experience with it. Whereas you'll remember that universal design is really more front-loading of supports to remove barriers that could potentially occur during the design process. While accessibility is primarily related to the product itself, usability is primarily related to the experience of the user. A tool may be accessible to the user in that he or she can use it independently, but it may not have the desired usability, meaning that it may not work effectively for that person. It may not be efficient or as efficient as another tool, or it may be difficult to use. The usability of a tool is just as important as the accessibility of it, because even though a tool may meet a specific need, if the user has difficulty using it or doesn't like to use it, then that is a barrier to him or her actually using it. So we're going to take a minute and practice identifying the difference between accessibility and usability in some scenarios. So the first one is about Chloe. She is a student with a visual impairment. She uses an iPad to complete her writing assignments. She takes a picture of the paper her teacher gives her and then uses the zoom feature to make it bigger so she can see it. In this example, the zoom feature is an example of which? Accessibility or usability? So if you chose accessibility, you would be correct. Remember, accessibility is primarily about the features of the product or tool. So in this case, the zoom feature is something that's built into the tool, and it's an accessibility feature. Let's try another one. Jason uses an eye gaze communication device. In the morning when he first gets up, he prefers to use his device via direct selection, which means he touches the screen with his finger to select something. However, he switches to the eye gaze system if he becomes too fatigued to direct select. So this scenario is an example of which one, accessibility or usability? In this case, if you chose usability, that would be correct. Again, Jason is choosing the type of feature he would like to use based on his interaction with it or his ability to use it. As he becomes fatigued and he's not able to direct select with his finger, he switches so that he can select with his eye gaze system. When we talk about accessibility, we need to ask ourselves some questions like these. Number one, do the tools we are using have the accessibility features our students need, or do we need to add features or characteristics to that tool? Number two, what do we already have in terms of accessibility that we haven't tapped into? Many Tech tools come with accessibility features already integrated into them, but they aren't turned on when they are purchased, so you have to turn them on. In terms of usability, the primary question we have to ask ourselves is how effectively and efficiently are our students using what is provided to them? I want to point out that this is not just for AT. Common items available in the classroom may or may not be accessible or usable for different students. For example, a pencil and paper may be the tool of choice for writing for many students, but it may not be accessible to a student with challenges to fine motor skills. There may also be students who are able to use a pencil and paper. In other words, it's accessible to them, but it's easier and much more efficient for them to use a word processor to communicate in writing. When identifying tools for our students to use, we need to make sure that we're striking the right balance between these two considerations. This is also a great time to go back to the SET framework and use it as a guide. When we choose a tool for an identified task, but the tool is too hard for the user, the usability factor negates the accessibility. If we choose a tool based on what is easy for the user, but it doesn't address the goal or task that was identified in the SET framework, then the tool isn't really what is necessary to meet the student's needs. This often happens when people see new tools that have really cool features or are high tech and students are really interested in them and want to use them, but they're not really helping meet the student's needs. So we have to make sure that we are balancing accessibility and usability in the context of the identified task in order to find the optimal tool for each situation. At this point, I want you to pause the video and complete question 1 on the Google form for the Tier 1 Access module and think about how your students using the tools available to them. Let's take a minute to think about access and the settings our students may encounter in school. When will our students require access? The short answer is anytime that there's a barrier to a task. Access is a huge area of consideration. The key is to think about where there can be barriers, what they are, and how to work around them. What could be barriers to the physical space? What barriers are there to using technology in the classroom or to accessing the academic content? And are there barriers to functional skills such as communication or self-care skills? The ideas listed here are just some potential barriers that we need to consider when thinking about assistive technology. So starting with your classroom or setting, think about environmental barriers that may prevent students from accessing things. Think about questions like, can the students move around the classroom freely? Can all students physically get to and use the items they need to participate in class? Do they have access to information in the environment, such as Braille? And what could prevent this from happening? Next, in thinking about the greater context of the school, picture the corridor or wing where your class is located. When the student leaves your room, can they navigate the hallway freely? Can they get to their other classes independently? And if not, why not? Thinking about the school building in general, are there places in the building that other students can go but are inaccessible to your students? Think about things like the cafeteria, the library, the gym, the office, the guidance office, or the nurse's office. What prevents students from having access to these places? Looking at the school grounds, can students access the entire campus of the school? If students in the regular education classes can go there, can students receiving special education go there as well? Think about playgrounds, track, fields, buses and transportation areas, etc. Finally, in the community, what barriers exist? For instance, during a community-based instruction or grade level field trip, are there barriers that could potentially occur there? Can deaf or blind students access information via Braille or sign language? Are historical buildings accessible via ramps or elevators? And what about students in wheelchairs? So these are all things to think about when we're talking about environmental access. Take a minute to think about where your students will experience barriers to environmental accessibility, and pause the video and complete question 2 on the Google form. These are the three basic access methods for communication. A student that can direct select will be more independent and typically more efficient in their communication. This simply means that the user can point directly to the item or picture and the communication response is tool generated. When using a single message switch, the communication is also quick and easy for the user to maintain independence. However, once switches become sequenced messages or a scanning system is used, communication begins to slow down. It can still be independent, but the user needs to wait for the scanning process to select what they want to say. In partner-assisted communication, the student is obviously not communicating independently. However, these systems are sometimes much quicker than using a switch because the partner becomes very good at helping the student. It can take some time to try these different types of access methods, but each user is different and their skill level will drive usability. Some factors to consider will be physical ability, cognitive ability, and motivation. Every student deserves a system of communication, whether it's using verbal speech, sign language, gestures, or any other system. It's important that the system is reliable, consistent, and available. When a student puts in the effort, they should be able to say what they want to say without a lot of mishitting or accidental activation. Tools should be working and charged. Once reliability is established, the system must stay consistent. The seating, positioning, and partner rules need to be the same every time. Clearly communicate to everyone what works with the student and what these expectations are. The tools need to be available at all times. If a situation where a tool could be damaged, like in the swimming pool, then an alternative system should be used, such as a laminated board. It's not acceptable to put the student's system away or make it impossible to access communication. The vocabulary in the system should be appropriate and stay in the system. The students should have regular opportunities to communicate throughout their day. Thinking about instructional access, looking at technology, does the district have the technology readily available to use the tool? You know, apps are great unless you don't have iPads or another type of tablet device. Teaching a student to touch type so they can participate in writing activities and use word prediction is great, but it doesn't work on a touch screen. Some kids may do better with a pencil and highlighted paper instead of an iPad. Some kids may need a computer or tablet to use a screen reader when other kids have hard copy text. The big question is, can they get to the things that they need? In terms of cognitive access, we need to consider access to the academic content. Things to think about are the complexity of the materials. Materials that are too complex in language or in how they are organized may result in students requiring tools to understand them. Physical access to instructional materials may take the form of ensuring that the necessary formats are available to the student. It could also mean making sure that there is print access to materials that are presented auditorily. Physical access could also relate to using tools that allow students to interact with materials in an alternate way, such as switches. Instructional usability can be broken down into three components. The first is the level of complexity. Does the tool have all the features needed to make it effective? If it has extra features, can they be disabled or hidden so they can be introduced and instructed incrementally, and so it doesn't become too overwhelming for the student? Second is compatibility. Can the tool complete the task for which it was designed? Do you need other things in order for the tool to be used, such as, do you need accessible text in order to use a reading software? If one tool doesn't do it all, then layering tools can be an option, but how many are too many? Is the identified task becoming more difficult because of too many tools being used to accomplish it? So for a student who is using reading and writing software, if they need to scan material, read it, write to it, and then annotate, and if they're using a separate tool for each task, is that becoming too much to handle? Can the tool work across environments and platforms? This is also a consideration for compatibility. If a tool requires an internet connection, for example, and the student doesn't have internet at home, it may not be compatible with the task if they're required to use that tool to do homework. Or you may need to have two separate tools to accomplish the same goal. Third is compatibility and choice of the user. So can the student work the tool? Does he or she need support? And if so, what is the plan for independent use? If your school has one-to-one Chromebooks and you hand a student an iPad, the student may resist that tool because it makes him or her look different. This has to be a consideration. Just remember, the best tool in the world is ineffective if it's in the backpack. Take some time to think about how you can take steps towards increasing instructional accessibility and usability for your students. Please pause the video and complete question 3 on the Google form. As you continue to explore the idea of accessibility and usability for your students, you may want to check into some of these resources. They will be available in the Live Binder so you can easily access them. Thank you for taking the time to complete Module 3. If you have any questions about this module or would like to discuss your role in the AT process, please feel free to email or call us by clicking on the link and checking our CAIU Assistive Technology website. Please also remember that AT consultants are available for in-person training and consultation with your team.